Now, sometimes culture and cultural trends don't always diffuse peacefully and willingly to new areas and new peoples. And we've seen this before in this class. The early years of the caliphate and the spread of Islam were mainly done by force. European culture and technology is essentially forced upon the Americas as well. And when it comes to industrialization, this is the case in Japan as well. So, the middle of the 19th century, Western European states and the United States are all drastically in need of new markets for their consumer goods. Their industries are producing at breakneck speeds, and they are desperate to gain access to the markets of China. They're desperate to bring their cheap consumer goods to the massive Chinese population. And Japan represents a perfect trade post and a perfect outpost, a perfect rest stop along the way to China, especially for the United States. So, in the middle of the 19th century, the United States gets together with Great Britain and Russia, and to a lesser degree, the French and the Dutch, and they force Japan to sign some rather unfavorable treaties, which opens up Japan to Western industrial products, to Western militaries. And along the way, it also brings industrialization to the Japanese people. And this is a rather humiliating series of events for the Japanese government. And this creates basically the largest political and social upheaval in Japanese history. Now, if you remember back to what we talked about in the unit on classical Asia, for probably the last 1300 years or so up to this point, Japan has remained a feudal society. It has been divided amongst powerful warlord led clans, and this feudal system is headed by one overall imperial warlord known as the shogun. Now, thanks to these embarrassing treaties that the Japanese government has been forced to sign with these Western powers, the Japanese people openly revolt against the shogun. And the shogun is overthrown, and power over the country is restored to the emperor. And this leads to a complete overhaul of Japanese society and Japanese industry. The emperor, known as the Meiji Emperor, the Enlightened Emperor, begins to completely restructure the Japanese way of life, the Japanese government, the Japanese social structure. Feudalism is brought to an end. The landed nobility, known as the daimyos, and their warrior class, known as the samurai, are officially stripped of their titles and their lands, and they become subordinated to the monarchy. Essentially, they become government agents, they become government employees. Feudalism is completely outlawed, which, just like in Russia, frees the peasant population to now move to the cities in search of economic opportunities. A democratic constitution is written, a limited monarchy is now installed with the emperor as the head. Now, culturally, the emperor is seen as essentially a living god, but there are limits placed on his political power. And you see the beginnings of some democratic institutions, a Japanese parliament is created, etc. But because of the emperor's cultural significance, because of the fact that he is seen as a living god, that he is the embodiment of the Japanese people, even with the limits on his political power, the emperor is able to undertake a massive socialist approach to industrialization. And industrialization becomes a government directed initiative. Okay. And this socialist government approach is combined with this kind of nationalistic pride to rebuild Japan in the model of these Western countries that have humiliated them. And we'll talk more about this when we get to imperialism. But this is known as the Meiji Revolution or the Meiji Reconstruction or the Meiji Reformation, whatever term you want to give it. And a lot of this is similar to what happens in Russia. Peasants are forcibly relocated by the government into cities. They are forced to work in government run factories and on government run railroads. But one of the things that the Japanese do that's unique in their response to industrialization is not only do they model themselves after Western Europe and the United States, they actively seek out Western methods, Western technology, Western experts. The Japanese come to Western Europe, they come to the United States, and they actively hire experts to come back to Japan and to help create industrial production facilities. They hire inventors from all over the Western world to come to Japan and put together a modern industrial infrastructure, right? They also then turn around and send their best and brightest students to Western universities to absorb intellectual, technical knowledge, to learn Western styles of government, Western methods of law, Western methods of science. And in Japan, Western culture, specifically American culture and Western European culture, become very popular and become very in vogue. And all of this takes place in an incredibly short period of time. And the Japanese are able to industrialize and update not only their society, but their entire economy within a span of roughly about 50 years. I mean, it's one of the greatest economic and cultural turnarounds that the world really has ever seen, right? So this chart gives you an idea of what takes place under this Meiji regime or this enlightened regime. Politically, they adopt a style of government based on the German model. They practice equality under the law. They establish a Western style bureaucracy and infrastructure. They use technology to enhance their military. And like I said earlier, they end the privileges of the daimyo and the samurai class and turn them into essentially government employees. Economically, they, like I said, go out and fully embrace Western methods of industrialization. They fully embrace Western style laissez faire capitalism. The government takes on the leading role in industrialization. They build factories, they build up entire industries, and then they essentially sell them off to these wealthy families, these former daimyos, that then create these massive government sponsored monopolies over certain industries, which become known as zaibatsu. In fact, a lot of the Japanese companies that you are familiar with, Toyota, Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, all of these companies begin as these kind of government sponsored zaibatsu monopolies in the 19th century. In terms of social upheaval, again, equality before the law. The distinctions and privileges between the samurai class, the daimyo class, are brought to an end. They set up Western style schools and universities. Free public education is installed in Japan in the late 1800s. And they actively and aggressively go out and hire Western experts to come to Japan and to teach the following generations of Japanese students in Western style learning, scientific method, Enlightenment ideas about government and law, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as much as Japan sees the most dramatic change from industrialization, Latin America sees the least amount of change from industrialization. Industrialization really does not take hold in Latin America. And a lot of this is thanks to the system of colonization that the Spanish and the Portuguese instilled in Latin America over those 350 years of colonization, right? So some of the reasons that industrialization really doesn't take hold is after the Spanish crown and the peninsulare social class are shoved out of Latin America during those Latin American revolutions, the Creole class, which are the pureblood Spanish who were born in the Americas, step in and they fill that vacuum. They take over as the new landowning class, the new political class. And as industrialization introduces itself into Latin America, those powerful Creole landowners who have been in power since the end of the Latin American revolutions are not willing to give up their status. They're not willing to see themselves decline in favor of the middle class the way that things happened in Western Europe. Another reason that industrialization really doesn't take hold in Latin America is because after the Latin American revolutions, thanks to this highly stratified social casta in Latin America, it's very hard for governments to gain widespread support. There's too many racial and ethnic and social divisions in Latin America for any government to build like a strong unified base. And so the governments in Latin America are very unstable, and which means that they're not able to give their support to growing industrialized business, right? Another reason that it doesn't really take hold in Latin America is the lack of infrastructure. The majority of these Latin American countries lack the necessary infrastructure to make industrialization happen. Quality roads, quality ports, quality shipping, especially railroads, are virtually non existent in Latin America until the very earliest parts of the 20th century. But probably the most important reason that Latin America doesn't see a strong push towards industrialization is they lack the middle class capitalists that existed in Western Europe and the United States. Again, and this is a byproduct of that highly restrictive social casta system, which had been instilled by the Spanish hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Leading up to the revolutions in Latin America, the Creoles were essentially what you would consider the middle class. Some mestizos were considered socially and economically middle class, but for the most part, those middle class, those industrial middle class jobs, you know, factory owners, business owners, professionals like doctors and lawyers, were all occupied by the Creoles. And when the Peninsulares are expelled and the Creoles now become the new landowning powerful class, again, they're not willing to give up their positions of power in order to allow industrialization to really kind of take root in Latin America. And since they own the land, and they're unwilling to buy into industrialization, the economies of most of these Latin American states remain devoted to the production of raw materials, basically just like they were under mercantilist capitalism. Um, so very little industrialization takes place in Latin America. The majority of the investment into industrialization in Latin America actually comes from foreign countries, mainly the United States and European business monopolies. Probably the best example of this is going to be the Panama Canal. In the early part of the 20th century, the United States funds a massive project to basically dig a canal through Panama to cut down on shipping times from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And this project takes a number of years and is extremely exploitive of the Panamanian workers. Thousands and thousands of people die during this project because of unsafe labor conditions. And then once the project is completed, the United States government pressures the Panamanians into signing over the rights to the canal to the United States so that they can operate this canal, they can ensure that it stays open, and they can ensure that the Panamanians don't profit from it by being able to tax travel and trade through that canal. So, what this means for Latin America is that even the small amounts of investment in industrialization that take place in Latin America don't see any financial benefit for those states and for those communities. The profits generated by them don't go reinvested back into more capitalization and more industrialization in Latin America. Those profits from those building projects actually leave Latin America and go back to Western Europe or to the United States.